A constitution can be seen as the blueprint of a government, the source document for a nation. It lays out the mechanics of the country, and while we might hope that those machines are flawless engines of growth and progress, the truth is that they often hide terrifying loopholes. Today, we'll discuss one of the most relevant glitches in America's Constitution, the debt ceiling. Welcome to No One is Competent. It's good to have you here today on the show dedicated to exposing the shoddy ground our society stands upon. I'm Jay, and I'm joined, of course, by Azalea. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce, and you can find us on Twitter at Jaharis48 and at Azalea Wyatt. You can reach the show in general at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com, and before I introduce my co-host, let me urge you to help the podcast out. There's no ads or sponsors on this show, so please give back however you can. If you're on YouTube, ask us questions in the comments. If you're on Apple, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps us out. And with all of that out of the way, Azalea, you want to start the show? You did write this episode after all. Are you excited about this one?
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are ready and prepared for the worst episode that this show will ever have. This is a fucking dumpster fire of a script. I know. I wrote it. I deleted like 6 pages of work on Tuesday. Jay,
it can't be worse than the Lost episode.
If I, you would be the one to know. If I suggest myself writing a script within the next 6 months, just like fucking throw a brick at my knees.
I'll make sure that we
especially if I say it's going to be easy. You remember the last time I said something was going to be easy and then all the president's doc was 36 pages long?
Yeah. Well, I'll make sure that you get to do a lot of episodes, write a lot of episodes for the foreseeable future.
I was like, oh, it's going to be easy. This is like a thing that's in the news. We'll just explain the thing that's in the news, and we'll get the clicks. And, like, that's probably not true. I know everybody just wants to hear about fucking Napoleon jacking off and making all the Austrians cry. But, like, I wanted to fucking expand the scope of this show, goddammit. And all I did was get confused. There's no fucking... Alright, so we're talking about the fucking debt ceiling today.
Indeed.
But we're not going to talk about it in a linear path. Instead, we are going... the debt ceiling is like a flower of incompetence. A blossom of shit, shall we say. And we are going to inspect the various petals on this shit blossom. Going from, like, what it is to what it does to how it causes problems to, like, how it can maybe be solved. And, like, there's all sorts of incompetence around this. Why this fucking script got as long as it did. Anyway, the sources for this bitch are Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein, What Makes Online Content Go Viral by Jonah Berger and Catherine Milkman for the University of Pennsylvania. The Polarization Today's Congress Has Roots to Go Back Decades by Drew DeSilver for Pew Research. I assume that's who you get if you can't get Nate Silver. Coin Seigniorage and the Irrelevance of the Debt Limit by Carlos Mucha. The former U.S. Mint director behind the controversial law explains why a platinum coin could avoid a major crisis by Joe Weisenfall for Insider. Bypassing Congress on the federal debt. Executive branch options to avoid default by Stephen Schwartz for Duke Law. The Big Problem of Any Debt Ceiling Fix by Dylan Matthews for Vox. And Debt the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. But do not get your hopes up. We are not talking about any of the fun parts of that book.
David Graeber has been your Oshie the past few months.
He was a cool dude. He was like, yo, society fucking sucks.
Number one David Graeber fanboy.
Also, economists are dumb. Alright, so, especially for our non-American listeners, we're going to start off with Government 101. The United States of America has a federal government that spends money on everything from roads to raiding the basement of your cousin Nikki. What money the government spends is determined by Congress. That's in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8.
Every year, Congress drafts up a budget for how much money is going to be spent and on what. This obviously is a matter of vigorous debate, and surely involves congressional clerks doing the most Adderall one would see outside of Azalea's last-minute writing sessions. Now, Congress writes the laws, but under the Constitution, it's the president and the executive branch who execute the laws.
Hence the term executive branch.
Indeed, yeah. The money comes from the U.S. Treasury, which is filled from taxes collected from the American people. Taxes are what fund the government, or at least that's what we're going to assume for now, because that's pretty much the mainstream understanding of how government works, for now.
Listen, if we got into it, it would be like another hour of this podcast that I frankly don't want to do. So, yeah, sure, taxes are what fund the government. Let's just keep repeating the lie.
Yeah. So Congress orders money to be spent and the Treasury spends the money. But what happens when Congress orders more money to be spent than the Treasury has? You can't just not spend the money. The budget Congress wrote, after all. That means it's a law and the laws must be obeyed. Obviously, the government goes into debt. What they do is they issue bonds. Bonds are issued by the federal government to banks, foreigners, ordinary citizens, etc., etc. You almost certainly know someone who owns some federal bonds or did so at some point. If you have a bank account, then your bank is almost certainly using your money to buy a large amount of them.
The United States does not go into debt the way you or I or a corporation would go into debt. If I needed money, I might ask Jay for a loan, and they would have to agree before giving me the money. Under this system, the federal government simply declares itself in debt and then asks for someone to buy it, which is very, very different. For most of its history, the government mainly issued bonds when it went to war. That's when governments spend the most money, and that's generally true for most governments in history across the board, whatnot. Wars are expensive. During World War I, for example, a massive propaganda operation encouraged Americans to buy bonds out of a patriotic duty and thereby fund the war that would feed their sons into an industrial wood chipper. Before 1917, Congress had to vote to issue bonds every time it wanted money. But considering how expensive World War I was going to be, they decided to expedite that process and just give the Treasury the ability to print whatever bonds it needed, but put a ceiling or limit on the total amount, so it didn't get out of control. Now, in 1939 and 41, this process was formalized by the Public Debt Acts, and these acts grouped all federal debt together and set a cap for the whole thing, and thus the debt ceiling we know and love was born. The ceiling was first set at $65 billion, an intentionally titanic number. Perhaps the original drafters of the law assumed we never reach it. The way the law works, once the debt hit $65 billion, no more debt would be able to be issued. It would be illegal to do so.
So, imagine you are the U.S. Treasury. Every year, you get orders from the government on taxes to raise and money to spend. It is illegal for you not to spend that money, so you often issue bonds to get everything funded. But independently, you have a law making it illegal for you to borrow after a certain point. So what happens if the only way to fund everything Congress asked for is to break the debt limit? If you broke the limit, you'd be breaking the law. And if you didn't break the limit to fund the budget, you'd also be breaking the law. This is the debt ceiling crisis, a glitch in the system caused by two laws crashing into one another.
Yeah, it's literally just like an error code for the government, right? I can't think of a simpler way to explain it than that. Does not compute.
Yeah.
Before we move on, it's worth noting how titanically stupid this is. The debt ceiling does not have to exist. it's not even in the Constitution. It exists because Congress chose for it to exist, and Congress could choose to write it out of existence tomorrow. There is nothing stopping them from doing that besides themselves.
Yeah, and, on that point, almost no other country does this. Very few other countries have a debt ceiling. A couple of them.
Yeah, I actually had that later
like,
in the script.
Yeah,
but
okay.
yes, it is. There's like 2 or 3 others. It's South Korea, United Kingdom, Russia. No, other countries don't do this, which is weird because, as we'll get into later, like their debt is a lot less valuable than ours.
Yeah.
So we'll get into why the debt ceiling has been kept around later, but obviously it exists because decades ago, Congress thought it would be prudent for the country to not be so far in debt. In this country, and I assume a lot of others, we tend to think of debt as inherently bad, a thing one best escape as soon as possible. There's a lot of moralizing around debt. Being in debt hurts one's reputation. A bad credit score can keep you from renting an apartment these days. You probably have debt of your own, or at least some strong feelings about it. Regardless, we'd actually have put those feelings on America's debt aside for most of the episode. We promise to get to it in the end. But for now, we'd like to just assess the debt ceiling as a federal policy and look at all the problems it's caused. At the end, you can weigh our analysis with your personal beliefs to come to your own conclusions. Now, with all the fuss that the debt ceiling causes in the modern era, including, while we are recording this podcast, Jay, wouldn't it be great if, the Republicans and the Democrats, came together in peace and love and, fixed the whole problem that people are seeing in the headlines, tomorrow?
Yeah.
Before this launches on Friday.
Yeah, sure. I suppose, but I have a feeling that probably won't happen. Though if it happened just to spite us, then that would be pretty funny.
It would be pretty funny. Alright, with all of the fuss in the modern era, you might be surprised to learn that for the first half-century of its existence, the debt ceiling caused basically no problems in Washington. America quickly reached the debt ceiling during World War II, so the Public Debt Act was amended to raise it again. That's technically what raising the debt ceiling is. It's amending the Public Debt Acts, but whatever. Then it was amended again and again and a 4th time, each seen as a prudent decision during war. But most of the times the debt ceiling has been approached, its number has been raised without objection, even in peacetime. In fact, out of the 90-ish times the ceiling has been raised, only half a dozen of those saw enough controversy to make it onto Wikipedia. There was a mild scuff up in 53 during the early years, but the debt crisis really didn't become a thing until 95.
In 1995, the debt ceiling needed to be raised, but the Speaker of the House of Representatives refused to raise it. This would happen again in 2011 and 2013. Normally, we'd explain them all in chronological order, but that would imply that they all played out different or that the lessons we learned from one to the other. That is not the case. See, this is not a story about the flaws of American law. This is a story about how the flaws of American law are exploited by politics. So, Google will tell you that there have been 4 major debt ceiling crises in America. 1995, 2011, 2013, and, well, as we are recording this podcast, in 2023.
April the 29th, baby.
Technically, the 1995 fight is, it's a disagreement over the budget. The budget is what creates the deficit, and the debate that at the time had folks angered about the debt, spending, and budget all in the same breath.
Side note, we today cannot comprehend how much the national deficit was a talking point in the 90s. You had people legitimately asking presidents about it in debates. How do you think the national debt influences everyday Americans. Your average person was convinced that it was a serious problem that we needed to talk hard about.
I think we had a little bit of a shade of that in the early Obama years, with the Tea Party caucus and everything, which we'll kind of get into as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're about
nowadays,
to get into.
Yeah, nowadays, definitely, it's like not as big of a thing. Though that may change. Yeah. So while we're doing these technicalities, the government also shut down in the winter of 2018 and 2019, but these were over disputes of the funding of a single program, that being then President Trump's border wall. The debt ceiling wasn't involved. And, that's also a note. Sometimes people can get debt ceiling and government shutdowns confused. We'll go into that a little bit later, but they're not the same thing, though they can coincide.
You can see why this episode script became a bit of a fucking mess. Now, these 4 events are so similar, we're just going to talk about them in parallel. In 1995, the U.S. House of Representatives was taken over by the Republican Party. New Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, had delivered a near unprecedented victory last November by campaigning nationally. Right-wing pundits echoed his declarations that government spending had gotten out of control and that President Clinton had to be stopped. The controversy over the budget continued all year, with Clinton promising to veto any budget that would cut benefits for Americans. In 2011, the House of Representatives was once again taken over by Republicans, this time helmed by John Boehner. Boehner had been carried into power by the Tea Party movement, which was a conservative backlash to the election of President Barack Obama. This movement was heavily funded by the fossil fuel industry, but successfully dominated American airwaves with complaints that the national debt was too high, mainly due to the newly passed Affordable Care Act. After months of negotiations, a tentative compromise was reached that July, but in 2013, Republicans took the exact same position, demanding that Obamacare be defunded in exchange for raising the debt ceiling. And in 2023, the Republicans have yet again retaken the House, this time led by Kevin McCarthy. Though led is a bit of a strong term. Even before McCarthy was sworn in, there was talk of a fight over the budget, with the same push from conservative news outlets. On January 19th of this year, the U.S. passed the debt limit of $31.4 trillion. As we record this podcast, the Treasury has kept funding going by using several short-term solutions that we'll get into later, but the clock is ticking, and you living in the future may inhabit a world where time ran out. So each case features a Republican House wanting to slash spending, and a Democrat president refusing to do so. So what happened? Well, the 2011 fight rolled over into 2013 fight. The current fight is current. The 1995 and 2013 fights, though, those two saw a major disaster. In 1995, a budget ceased to direct America's funds, and in 2013, the debt ceiling was finally reached. This is the actual factual, technically only time the debt ceiling was hit. I mean, it got hit in January, but, we're not, quote, feeling the effects of it yet, so people might argue. That error message flashed onto the screen. America couldn't spend money or borrow money. So what happened? Well, the whole thing shut down.
So here we get into the topic of government shutdowns. And like I mentioned, a shutdown and the debt ceiling being hit are not exactly the same thing. So to go back a little bit, as we mentioned earlier, it's the job of Congress to set the budget for the federal government. They do this each year. Now, the Constitution says that the federal government cannot spend any money that has not been issued by an act of law. It's in Section 9, just after Section 8 of Article 1. So obviously, if a federal agency, runs out of their budget for the year, then obviously that means that they're done for, basically. Mm-hmm. Now, for the first 100 or so years of U.S. history, the government basically just ignored this. Federal agencies, either they wouldn't spend all the money they had been allocated, or they'd spend exactly how much. But by the time you get to the Civil War, and especially after the Civil War, which is when the federal government really grows a lot, agencies would blow through their budget for like the entire year in like 5 months, and then just go to Congress and be like, hey, you got to give us more money. And Congress would say, okay.
And I assume a lot of this has to do with corruption, graft, and people just outright stuffing their pockets.
Yeah. But eventually people got upset, and in 1884 they passed the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says, no, you can't do this. You really can't spend more than you've been allocated in your yearly budget. And they kind of just ignore it again for the next almost 100 years. This means that you will have like these funding gaps where an agency does run out of money technically, but like it doesn't cause a total government shutdown. They kind of just have to furlough some employees and kind of limp along. And this really changes in 1980. There's a little bit in the 70s that are kind of leading up to this, but in 1980, during the Carter administration, the Attorney General issues an opinion, a reinterpretation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, saying that no, if you're an agency and you hit your yearly amount, you really can't do anything. You're done. You have to stop operating everything except for essential services. And those essential employees, you can't even pay them. So that's what really creates the modern government shutdown. It means that if Congress hasn't, come to agreement on a yearly budget, whatever agencies haven't been funded, after, once their money's run dry, they're done. All their non-essential employees cannot come into work, cannot do anything. All non-essential services are shut down. This is why you might remember hearing about like the U.S. Park Service, like all the parks shutting down, the Smithsonian Museum shutting down, so on and so forth. Essential employees, like air traffic, monitors, a lot of like people in the Department of Defense and so on and so forth, do come in for work, but they're not paid. They get their back pay after the crisis is over, ideally. But they're not paid during the shutdown. And that's basically what a shutdown looks like. It typically doesn't involve every single agency. You'll get what is called partial shutdowns, because typically some of the agencies might get funded in the separate budget, like the military might get funded, but other agencies won't be. But you'll have these periods of time where just all non-essential services are suspended. Now, this has a lot of economic ramifications. However, those ramifications can be a little bit difficult to measure, and I think they could be a bit overblown. That's also partially because these shutdowns haven't lasted very long.
Yeah, like we're talking a matter of weeks.
Yeah, like the first ever shutdown was like 1 day or something like that. And the longest was 35 days. And this means that you do have economic impacts because like companies that are, contracted to provide services for the government might lose revenue. They might have to lay people off. Government employees themselves will be spending less money. You'll have economic uncertainty over various issues. And this can slow down economic growth. In 2013, I think it was estimated that GDP growth slowed by 0.2 to 0.6%. Now, that being said, that's not the end of the world. Yeah, it is billions of dollars. It matters, and like for the people who are directly involved, if your business is involved in selling stuff to the government, that can mean a lot for you. For the everyday person, it typically isn't that noticeable. All of our listeners have lived through at least one government shutdown, unless we have some very young listeners, and probably didn't notice it at all.
Yeah, if you are 2 years old and your dad dropped his phone and like this podcast is being played in the nursery, don't worry, kid, it gets better.
Yeah.
But like the reason that they're not as disruptive is the vast majority of services that your average American encounters are provided by their state or local government, not the federal government.
Yeah.
like the biggest thing probably for a lot of people is like, post office not necessarily working. By far the biggest deal of government shutdowns is federal employees not being paid, which obviously can create, large food insecurity and whatnot for lots of people. And, that's real pain.
Yeah. And some people will be like, oh, like the government shut down for 1 week and I didn't notice it, so therefore we don't need the government. Setting aside, my co-host's opinions and anarchism, the reason why you don't feel these impacts is because these shutdowns have not lasted for long periods of time in the grand scheme of things. If you had one for like a year or something, you would probably notice. Now, going back to the debt ceiling, so the thing with a shutdown as a general generic shutdown versus a debt crisis, one of the things that separates them is that a general shutdown only affects spending that has to be allocated every year. This doesn't include all government spending. Social Security, for example, is not dependent on a yearly budget. Congress does not say this is the amount of money Social Security gets to issue each year. It's not dependent on that. So Social Security checks are not affected by a government shutdown. Treasury bond repayments are another thing. Those are not affected by a shutdown. With the standard shutdown, the Treasury can still issue their interest payments to people who own Treasury bonds. But if you hit a debt ceiling, that can actually dry up because those interest payments are raised in large part by selling more debt. So once you hit the debt ceiling, the clock is then ticking and you might have to eventually default on the debt. That's when you can no longer issue those payments. That is very bad. And this is why in 2011, when there was the threat of hitting the debt ceiling, it didn't eventually happen until 2013, the US's debt rating got downgraded from AAA to AA+.
Yes, which is like the international... Is it the International Monetary Fund that determines that?
This was by Standard & Poor's, which is like a private company, but their ratings are widely accepted as one of the standards.
Yeah, so the U.S. was downgraded from like the top tier to the second to top tier in terms of like if you're going to get your money back from them on the world stage. And we discussed how in many ways government shutdowns, quote, aren't that bad, but that's mostly because, as Jay said, they haven't been that long. I think government shutdowns, they're more of a political firestorm. Their impact is much larger in the political sphere. Americans don't like pauses in government services, and one thing shutdowns tend to do is make Americans mad at everyone. Basically, whenever there's a government shutdown, the fact that the government is shut down is in the news every day, and Americans dislike having politicians be on the news, and politicians dislike the news being about them. And they just kind of make everybody mad, on top of wreaking havoc on social services. Hypothetically, if they went on long enough, they could wreak havoc on the stock market or damage the entire economy for a year.
Because, yeah, if you think, for example, new like construction projects or, mining or oil exploration or whatever, those are things that require permits. Those permits are issued by the government. If the government is shut down, they can't issue those permits. This is just one example in one industry where if the government shut down for 2 weeks, whatever, you wait 2 weeks to get your permits. If the government was shut down for a year, then that'll start having an impact.
Yeah, and it will start to get people to question, quote, the fabric of our society. And the threat of this shutdown is what looms over every congressional fight over the budget and the debt ceiling, because if something's not resolved, this is what happens. In practice, the debt ceiling is a bomb wired to the American economy. Only Congress has the ability to keep it from tanking the country, so it's used as a threat to extract concessions from the opposing party. It's a racket, a problem caused by Congress that only Congress can solve. We remind you, they invented it. And every year that it sticks around is a year that Congress is okay with letting that bomb go off again. Once again, the vast majority of countries do not have this bomb system.
Yeah, not only do they not have the debt ceiling, most countries don't have a concept of a government shutdown due to yearly budgets. Sometimes they'll have government shutdowns due to like not being able to form a government in some parliamentary systems. But then usually there's a provision in place for the with some sort of executive like a president to kind of limp along. But yeah, this is why you don't hear about government shutdowns in anywhere else besides the United States.
Yeah, and another thing is that the way these negotiations work is that both sides, on practical levels, they're Republican and Democrat, but either side is basically like saying, give us what we want or the government will shut down. And the other one's saying, give us what we want or the government will shut down. And they're both kind of like betting that the other one's going to blink first, or that when the government shut down, the opposing side is going to be blamed for it by the people. And it's just a game of chicken, playing with these bombs, which I think no matter your politics, we can agree is an irresponsible and dumb way to organize the government. So the debt ceiling and budget are two massive bombs strapped to the side of the economy. But the systems that rule them have been in place for at least decades. Why has this only become a problem in recent years? So let's go to our next pedal and talk about radicalization in American politics. Now, if you're American and you're young enough to be listening to this podcast, you've probably heard an older family member lament that there's no decorum in modern politics, or whatever happened to bipartisanship. The fact of the matter is the politics that they grew up with bear little in common with the politics of today.
80 years ago, the Democrat and Republican parties were not ideologically coherent, meaning they disagreed with each other a lot. There were liberal Democrats, liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats, and conservative Republicans, and everything in between on both sides. In his book, Why We're Polarized, Ezra Klein argues that it is best to understand politics in the mid-20th century as America having 4 or more parties instead of 2. Conservative Republicans would regularly team up with conservative Democrats to block civil rights legislation, and there were similar alliances between progressives. Presidents regularly worked with a Congress that was not dominated by their party, and plenty of bills became law with votes from both parties all over them. This is obscenely wild from the modern context, but parties just weren't about ideology back then. They were just different colored teams to root for and patronage networks that competed for graft. Seriously, in 1959, there was a debate during the Republican National Committee over whether the party should be driven by ideological values. A faction of powerful Republicans invited political scientist Robert Goldwyn, who gave a speech saying, quote, "It is neither possible nor desirable for a major political party to be guided by principles." He went on to say that, quote, "With both parties, including liberals and conservatives within their ranks, those differences, which would otherwise be the main campaign issues, are settled by compromise within each party." He went on to warn that changing that paradigm would threaten national unity, which, yeah, it kinda did.
But eventually, the parties became ideological and Americans began to sort themselves. Over the course of 70 years, conservatives drifted to the Republicans and moderates and left-wingers drifted to the Democrats, with, of course, a massive chunk of Americans not voting and therefore usually being left out of this conversation. Never forget that. The story that's normally told is that this sorting process began with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, himself a son of the segregationist South, lamented that Democrats had lost the South for a generation. And the funny thing is that he was wrong. Democrats continued to be viable in the southern states for decades afterwards. For example, in Georgia, the empire of the South, This state had a Democrat governor every year of the 20th century. After the brilliant and short reign of Benjamin F. Conley, the state wouldn't have an elephant running the show until 2002. It took time for people to give up their old party loyalties. A lot of people just had to die. Those identities, they're really hard to shake. Moreover, politics at the time was highly local. Folks voted for whoever shook their hand the warmest and brought home the money. You really and truly cannot have local politics without corruption. Those two are synonyms. What you see in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s is a lot of split-ticket voting. Keeping with our Georgian example, it was common for folks to vote for a Democrat for a local office, alongside voting for Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, or George H.W. Bush for president. The Republicans took advantage of this shift first in America and crushed national elections in 80, 84, and 88 under the new conservative movement. We've already outlined what this movement was in our QAnon episode, so you can go listen to that if you want more. Suffice to say, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the conservative movement became very dominant in the United States. So dominant that Bill Clinton came to power in 92 as a Democrat, mostly by co-opting Republican ideas with slicker branding. That was another factor slowing the sorting of the parties. For a while in the late 20th century, there wasn't much difference between the two. Like, if you guys can remember our 2000 election episode, you'll remember that election was weirdly bereft of debates about the issues.
Yeah.
With the candidates being more aesthetically different than anything else. Finally, there was still a lot of bipartisanship in this period. You have to remember, these Democrat and Republican congressmen, they all know each other. They eat dinner together. They golf together. Rail cocaine off whores' asses together. These personal relationships made it easier for work to get done. Politics were tamer back then. There was less tension, less name-calling, because most politicians believed similar things and personally got along.
But once a party includes people who are mostly all the same, it gets extreme rather quickly, especially when exposed to an opposing group. The 90s saw the first modern politics that mimicked our own on an aesthetic level. In 1994, Newt Gingrich's Republican Party ran a national campaign insisting that federal spending was out of control and painting Democrats as big government liberals. This period also saw the rise of explicitly conservative news media. In the 60s, there were only 3 television stations, but with communication expanding on the TV and the internet, there was just more room for ideological specialization on the news. Early broadcast channels had also been restricted by the FCC's fairness doctrine. This rule required them to present controversial issues in a way that highlighted all major viewpoints. Its abolition in 1987 allowed for much more editorializing to wind up in the broad news.
Side note, if you're familiar with British politics, you'll kind of this is the difference between, say, BBC reporting and British newspaper reporting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm sure the folks at BBC have plenty of political leanings, but they are forced to try to appear impartial.
Yes.
Whereas privately owned newspapers have no such restriction, and thus can print whatever nonsense they want.
Yeah. Roger Ailes was an aide to President Richard Nixon, and during the Watergate scandal, he listened to his boss complain about how the press was covering the issue. Nixon wished that there had been a conservative network that could cover issues from his perspective. Ailes would later lead Fox News to prominence as America's top news station. But radio broadcasts had been radicalized long before TV. In the 90s, the central figure of conservative talk was Rush Limbaugh, who would open each show during Clinton's presidency by declaring it so-and-so the day of the Clinton occupation of the White House.
This, by the way, was sourced to my dad.
Big Rush Limbaugh fan?
No, my dad thought he was a wingbag. I mean, listen, my dad is not like the most politically correct guy in the world, but he did, for example, protest Reagan when Reagan was governor.
That's
Weed
good.
will do brilliant things to your politics.
I forgot that you're actually a Californian.
Do you get pleasure out of creating? Like, are you proud of yourself right now? Does this make you feel like a big man?
Possibly.
Now, conservative outlets are incentivized not just push a conservative agenda, but to command attention. They are pushed by the same market forces that all networks are pushed by. They want ratings, clicks, engagement, whatever. Don't forget to smash that like button. This incentivizes them towards incendiary content.
To cover how successful, it is for ratings, Fox News was the most watched of the big cable news networks every single year between 2000 and 2020, basically. Like 2 decades of dominance. To the point where around January 6th, when you had the whole incident that we did an episode on, the storming of Congress, that was like the first time in a long time where Fox was actually not the most watched national news network for a couple of days in a row.
Yeah, and like until Checks Watch 6 days ago, the most watched news show or show from a news network in America was Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News by like 2 million more views than the next runner-up.
Yeah.
Now, a 2012 study by Jonah Berger and Catherine Milkman demonstrated that content is more likely to be shared when it evokes emotion. They kind of tested out making people sad, worried, happy, elated, whatever, and see if they would more likely to share something. And they found that the emotion that drove someone to share something the most was anger. This makes sense in why incendiary news shows are some of the most popular. As the 90s gave way to the aughts and the teens, the Democrats would grow to have their own pundits and news shows. These days, you can open any podcasting platform and find hundreds of shows aiming to feed you politics as entertainment. And of course, these two sides feed off of each other because they use the outrage the other side evokes to grow their audience. Many of the most successful influencers in the political entertainment world will be the ones who insist on the most combat with the enemy. And as their profile raises, their listeners will put more pressure on politicians to be aggressive.
Ezra Klein highlights the Obama presidency as the final stage of the American political sorting. Whereas in the 50s, the demographics of the parties were relatively balanced, these days, an American is far more likely to vote Republican if they are white, live in a rural community, and lack a college degree. Americans who vote Democrat are much more likely to have the opposite attributes. And with so many intrinsic differences, how could the parties remain civil? A 2016 Pew Research poll found that 45% of Republicans and 41% of Democrats saw the other party as, quote, a threat to the nation's well-being. That's a radical, pressing worldview. And with pressure from the pundits and the base forcing them to take action or get primaried, politicians are forced to fight the other side on trivial issues.
Yeah, like we didn't go into it, but like if you don't know the vast majority of the ways that a national congressional politician gets thrown out of office in America is by being primaried by their own party, not defeated by their opposing party. This is because of gerrymandering and a whole 10 more minutes of podcast. But this means, this incentivizes people to be, quote, ideologically pure.
10 minutes of us lamenting the demise of Liz Cheney's political career.
Rest in power, queen. What the actual factual most pathetic being to ever walk the earth. What a fucking piss drinker.
But yeah, this is why every budget becomes a crisis, one that politicians are comfortable making threats over. One glance would show this to be a both sides problem. After all, in 2018, Democrat congressmen forced a shutdown with Trump after refusing to fund his border wall. But as fun as it would be to lay in the centrist cowardice, that's kind of far from the truth.
A Pew Research study of the politics of congressmen from 1992 to 2022 found that both parties moved away from the center. They did this by tracking scores given to congressmen by DW Nominate, which ranks ideology on a left-right axis, with 1 being fully conservative and -1 being fully liberal. 0, of course, being a centrist opinion. They found that since 1992, Democrats have moved away from the center by 0.06 points on this scale, while Republicans moved away by 0.25 points. If you scale that data out to 1972, you find Democrats moving by 0.25 points in total, while Republicans moved by 0.51 points, more than double. So the radicalization is, especially in terms of who gets elected, nowhere near equal. And this makes sense when you think of the nature of American conservatism. It's a reactionary movement. Its modern form birthed in response to the civil rights movement. Again, if you want more on that, see the QAnon episode. Over time, America has only become less white, less straight, less traditionally Christian. Conservatives haven't won a popular vote for president since 2004. When you see that you're losing, that you're dying, you lash out. And, in many ways, they aren't actually losing and they aren't actually dying. But their media is so focused on making them think that way that, why wouldn't they want to fight like their backs against the wall? Going off script, currently my church is being torn in like a weird fucking political split over those who want to stay with the United Methodist Congress and one who want to go join like an explicitly more homophobic denomination. And I have to like argue with 72-year-olds who are convinced that like they are going to face discrimination for their religious beliefs within like their lifetimes.
Yeah.
Of like 6 years if they're lucky.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. If you genuinely believe that, you will be thrown in jail for being a Christian, or that the Democrats are gonna make everybody into like Satanist pedophiles.
They're gonna force fem your kids.
Yeah, like you will. Which is rally
totally
around
incorrect.
The flag.
I am going to force fem your kids. Hide them. Hide them now. Yeah,
you'll get behind the people saying the most radical things. And like it's the snowball effect where it mutually reinforces each other that these people are like, well, you have to go to radical ends to protect your way of life from, the great evils that these people are saying are
gestures wildly. Yeah, again, not a very scientific opinion here, but like, I don't know, speak to your average 85-year-old who votes R or 75-year-old and just hear what comes out of their mouth. Now, there are arguments about what the conservative movement is going to be like in 10, 20, 30 years, a lot having to do with, the cohort I'm talking about, shall we say, aging out of the voting populace. Some assume the country will stabilize as different generations with different values age into leadership. There are those who doomsay about the coming civil war, and, that's what the radicalizing sides are leading us towards. A lot of people in my field in politics kind of think that's what's going down. I've seen a lot of evidence that, probably not. We don't actually know what's going to happen, but it looks like in the short term, politics is going to remain combative and focused on short-term arguing over long-term state building. There will be more debt ceiling crises again and again until American culture changes or the ceiling is eliminated.
Yeah, and that is because this is fundamentally a culture issue. The ceiling existed for decades in American politics without a problem. It didn't change, its context changed. It was something that could be used to hold the country hostage, and so it was used for that political leverage. Hypothetically, that leverage always existed. Again, the ceiling had been raised dozens of times by both parties without an issue, but it is only now that it is a practical problem. That being said, the debt ceiling is still a hilariously stupid thing for the country to have. It feels like such a self-inflicted problem in the legal code that could only exist in a work of parody. The vast majority of countries don't have debt ceilings. America doesn't have to do this. We don't have to do this, and yet we choose to.
Now, I'm sure a few of y'all listen to this thinking to yourselves, well, Republicans are to blame for this mess. They're the ones who keep threatening the debt ceiling. They're the ones that are so radical. And you're right, but Democrats have also held the government hostage over budget deals, and furthermore, if the debt ceiling is a problem caused by Republicans, why have the Democrats not eliminated it? Why have the Democrats shown no willingness to even discuss eliminating the ceiling as part of their platform? Whichever side you're on, the debt ceiling illustrates that American politics is quickly sorting into two kinds of scams. One is a hostage crisis, where extremists are willing to gamble with the lives of millions for the sake of their culture war battles. The second is a protection racket, the bomb squad who promises they can defuse the bomb, yet never fully remove it, and the party that insists that they are the only thing that can stop the other from destroying the country. Both parties increasingly hate the other, and both parties claim they're the only way to fight back. But neither would have that valence without the other, and the issue of the debt ceiling is a brilliant demonstration of that. Now, a lesser podcast would end there, but again, we've got more petals on our blossom of failure circling the debt ceiling. So, first let's return to those government shutdowns. See, it turns out that gambling with the country's economy might not be the best of ideas.
It's kind of funny that things work out the way they do. And I can kind of, I guess we think it will start in 95, 96 with Newt Gingrich. I can see what Newt Gingrich was thinking. And at the time, it probably made a lot of sense. And after all, Newt Gingrich had just taken the Republicans to capture the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. He's somebody who thinks that whatever he's doing is obviously great.
That he has a mandate from the American people.
Yeah, and he's probably thinking that, A, his messaging really resonates with the American people, and B, the general public kind of just blames the president for everything. If something goes wrong in politics, the president's to blame. So if the government shuts down, people will blame the president. But by making himself and the Republicans in Congress such a visible figure in this sort of duel between them and President Clinton, it kind of backfired. And that people didn't blame the president. People actually noticed Congress, because Newt Gingrich was wanting people to notice Congress, and they blamed the congressional Republicans. According to opinion polling, Clinton's approval rating remained steady or even improved, and obviously in 1996, he would go on to win re-election by a considerable margin, whereas opinion on the Republicans declined a little bit. And Newt Gingrich especially. Newt Gingrich also had a bit of an own goal where he gave an interview in which he mentioned that when he had gone on a trip with the president to the funeral of the Israeli prime minister in 1995, and Gingrich complained that he had to sit in the back of Air Force One, and he didn't get a meeting with the president. And the press kind of spun this as Gingrich shutting down the government over basically throwing a tantrum that he didn't get to sit in the fancy seat in Air Force One. It was not a great look for him, and that's why that. In 1996, the shutdown was resolved with a bill which mostly favored the Democrats. Again, in 2013, the Republicans make all this drama, the Tea Party caucus in specific, made a whole bunch of drama about how the debt's such a big deal and you have to balance the budget, and they shut down the government. And again, people mostly side with the Democrats. Well, I say they mostly side with the Democrats. When you look at polling, it'll be 40% blame the Republicans, 30% blame the Democrats, and the
Yeah, I'm
rest
sure
are like
most
undecided.
Republicans blame
Yeah.
the Democrats, and most Democrats blame the Republicans.
Yeah, like a lot of people still do blame the Democrats, but more of people thought that the Republicans in Congress were to blame. And again, this resulted in the party's popularity taking a hit. And eventually, after a lot of internal wrangling between the Tea Party caucus and the more, you say, a little bit more centrist Republicans, who were smart enough to realize that this was not polling well, they eventually caved in and gave Obama most of what he wanted. This is also like when the whole debate over like defunding Obamacare and everything, that was a big part of the debate. And like, spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. With the shutdown during the Trump administration, that's a little bit of an odd one because one, it's the Democrats that are shutting it down. But I'll say that two, politics was just even more polarized by that point that it had been under the Obama years. That I think in that case, people just really rallied behind their specific camps. And I don't think it had a huge impact on the popularity of either side. Obviously, the Democrats would go on to have, to win the presidency in 2020, but I don't think it has much of a big impact.
Yeah, there's a lot of like, I don't know. I remember the 2018 one. Everyone just wanted to lick Nancy Pelosi's slit. Like, oh my God, Trump got owned so hard.
Yeah.
Even though, like, what was actually happening is that, like, the broader Republican Party, besides Trump, like, really didn't give a shit about the border wall. And,
Yeah.
we're kind of just doing, like, we're going to be publicly angry about it to satisfy themselves.
Then I think also there's almost, again, in 95, government shutdown, a huge thing. Because previous shutdowns had only been like 1 day or 2 days or whatever. Like that's like the first really long one. And then you got to 2013, they're like, okay, it's been a long while since the last really long government shutdown. I think by 2018, like the public is sort of used to it. And I think of that discourse that we're having this year, which we'll get into on a little bit later, I think now the general public is just like used to government shutdowns, that it's no longer like a big scare thing. I think most people just have the opinion that, Congress throws a tantrum, some people in DC get angry, and then they pass a budget in like 2 weeks' time, and the whole process then repeats itself, the next year.
Yeah, like, I feel like sometimes Congress thinks that it's like a high-stakes drama that the country is tuning into, forgetting that, like, that's when the country hates them the most. And also, like, people don't care actually that much. And also, like, people are fickle and will just hate whoever inconveniences them the most. And that's why usually the side who forces the shutdown is the one who gets punished for it. And it's just hilarious how these budget arguments, like, usually don't, convince a vast swath of Americans to come over to somebody's side.
No.
If anything, it is increasingly just posturing for your own party in order to make sure you look tough.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think it's telling that, in 2013, the shutdown was very much driven by the Tea Party caucus. And that was a thing. And if you're looking at like nowadays, the whole looming crisis is very much, I think, driven by the far right of the party. Whereas they have their own agenda, which works well with their specific base and their voters, and they kind of bully almost the Republican leadership into going along with it. Whereas I think somebody like McCarthy is kind of probably wouldn't do this on his own volition. I think McCarthy is more or less just an opportunist who goes with whatever works in a given situation.
I don't know. He is, by all reports, a very dumb man.
Yeah.
And, yeah, an opportunist, like, to his core.
Yeah.
I doubt he really believes in much. For those who don't know, McCarthy failed to become Speaker the beginning of the year, 14 times before he was elected in the 15th vote. This was hilarious, and we know a little bit of what he promised Republicans in order to give him the job, but a lot we don't know what he promised, and it's his position is there by a thread. So Jay, is there anything else we need to know about this crisis and how it's looking as of, again, April the 29th of 2023?
I think we've about covered it, but yeah, it's, the current debt ceiling was, I think it was $31.4 trillion, and that was passed a few years ago, and the U.S. hit it in January. And since then, the Treasury has basically been relying on a bunch of financial tricks to kind of get by. But they think that, those stopgap measures will be exhausted by the summer. So that's kind of the situation we are right now. And of course, we have a Republican majority in Congress, led by Speaker McCarthy, that got elected in the last midterms. So that's why we are looking at another one of these budget crises.
Yeah, he's basically saying Biden cut the budget, and Biden's just like, fuck off. And it's like, maybe there's going to be a shutdown, maybe there won't be. Maybe Biden will, be able to get what's called the clean budget, the clean deficit raise, where the deficit gets raised without him having to change the budget. Maybe there will be a mild change that tries to satisfy both parties. Maybe it'll all go to shit, and this is what leads to the next civil war. Probably not. Crucially, the Republicans only need 5 or so defections from their side before their majority crumbles. A lot of why they were able to take control of the House of Representatives, if we want to get really nerdy, is because of seats they won in, say, New York, which is going to be quite centrist. So if those Republicans would be more comfortable cutting a deal than McCarthy in general, if 5 of them just swap on over, it can get done. But the Dems are also heavily incentivized to keep the economy on track as the country nears another presidential election. So who fucking knows? All we know is that the government services are going to get gambled with. Paychecks that support the kids of government employees are going to gamble with. The only question is how much and how long. But it doesn't have to be this way. Cue the music. Next pedal on our shit blossom. What are the other ways that we could solve the debt ceiling crisis?
Yeah, there are theories on how to solve the crisis of the debt ceiling without actually doing the smart thing and eliminating the debt ceiling itself, because that would be too obvious. But yeah, let's go through them, starting with the most hilarious. So number 1, mint the coin.
Mint the fucking coin!
The first version of this theory was cooked up by a guy named Carlos Mucha in 2011. He pointed out the fine print of Section 5136 of Title 31 of the U.S. Law Code.
By the way, I have read Section 5136 of Title 31 of the U.S. Law Code, and let me tell you, it is a riveting piece of prose right there.
Sounds exciting. But yeah, this law created a fund within the Treasury that could be used to hold any miscellaneous funds the Treasury may acquire during its operations, such as when it sells collectible coins. The law sets up what the Treasury Department can do with this fund, what can be added from it, and how it can borrow from it, and crucially, the law gives the Treasury the power to deposit any money from the fund that it doesn't think it needs into the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, and all that is done at the Treasury's discretion.
Now, Mucha's original argument is drowning in fiscal and legal jargon, but essentially he argued that because the Treasury could deposit money from that fund into the Federal Reserve, that is to say the National Bank, at its own discretion. This was combined with the revelation from Section 5112, which allowed the Treasury to mint platinum coins of any denomination at their own discretion.
Both of these laws were made in the mid-90s, by the way, and this was only, put together in the early teens. But if you put it all together, you might conclude that it is possible for the Treasury to mint a platinum coin worth, say, $1 trillion, transfer it to the Fed, and have that count as revenue towards the federal budget. Because the coin was never issued and it never touched the market, it doesn't have to be backed by bonds. Once it reaches the Fed, it can be melted down to repeat the process as many times as necessary, creating what can only be described as an infinite money glitch in real life. Experts have been arguing for a decade whether or not this is technically legal, as you may have gleaned from the way I announced it. This is a bit of a meme in the economic law community, but there are some serious voices saying, well, the math works, it should be possible. Former Mint Director Philip Daly claims it's legal. Current Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen claims it's not because she hates fun. Ultimately, the biggest problem facing this theory is its sheer absurdity. President Biden probably won't go for such a flagrant declaration that the money isn't real, and for other reasons that we'll kind of get to later.
The second strategy would be to issue debt that has, quote, "This is not federal debt," written on the side. So Duke law professor Stephen L. Schwartz argued that the Treasury could create what the government calls a special purpose entity. Schwartz is apparently an expert on how local and state governments create little government programs to dodge all sorts of laws and hide money. They're like shell companies for governments. A good example is a special district that allows Disney to control the land around Disney World and maintain its roads and whatnot. I'm sure that there's currently no ongoing political drama relating to that.
I mean, listen, it's the one that people are going to know about the most. You probably live in a special district if you're living in the United States for, controlling mosquitoes or providing water services or something. There's thousands of them.
Yeah. Anyway, he purposes that the Treasury create a special purpose entity and then issue bonds from that. Because they're technically not Treasury bonds, they technically wouldn't count towards the debt ceiling. He proposes backing these bonds with future tax revenue. Like minting the coin, this probably won't happen because it's too flagrantly silly. There's also the factor that Schwartz does work for a Duke, so maybe this theory isn't being considered because he's been correctly identified as a scoundrel bereft of valor.
You ever been to the Duke campus, Jay?
I have not.
Smells of snakes, indoor or outdoor. The current strategy is just rob Peter to pay Paul. Janet Yellen has been emptying government funds from bureaucrat pensions and a few short-term reserves, but the money is set to run out in a few weeks. The fourth option would be to declare the debt ceiling unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment and just pretend it doesn't exist. The 14th Amendment has a passage that states, "The validity of public debts of the United States shall not be questioned." And you could interpret that to mean that a debt ceiling is unconstitutional, but that argument is weak, and there's another problem with that plan we'll get to in a moment. Option 5, which generally people will consider to be more boring than option 4, but I actually think is more interesting because fuck you, is that Biden could declare ignoring the debt ceiling to be the, quote, least unconstitutional option. Now, this has been mainly argued by Cornell law professor Michael Dorff and University of Florida law professor Neil Buchanan. Their argument comes down to this idea that government shutdowns are unconstitutional because they mean the president isn't spending money like Congress asked. Remember when we talked about how, this is all because there's an error code that, you can't do these two things at once. Well, they argue that, these two principles are not of equal weight and one should override the other.
Yeah.
Because supposedly, because it's in Article 8 of the Constitution, the president not spending the money Congress asked for is supposedly more unconstitutional than ignoring the debt limit. So you have to ignore the debt limit in order to be as least unconstitutional as possible, shall we say. Now, the problem with options 4 and 5 is that they invite litigation, and no one wants a Supreme Court ruling on any of this, neither side. And frankly, I don't think anyone knows how they would rule. This is not something they usually mess with. The debt ceiling crisis gives leverage to Congress. They're not going to pawn that power off to the courts, especially with, again, no one really knowing how it's all going to go out and it all being completely theoretical. I do find it fascinating that, like, it's not fully decided that, like, you know, if you're doing rules lawyering for the country, that, like, a government shutdown is supposed to be what happens when the government runs out of money. As Jay highlighted towards the beginning, like, there was a time before the 80s when that was not seen as, like, what should happen if the department runs out of money.
A lot of this is literally based on an interpretation of a law by an attorney general, Carter's attorney general. And you could really just reinterpret it, but that would probably cause Congress to throw a fit and maybe kick it to the courts. I don't know.
Well, it's amazing, like, how much of our legal system is just based on, like, yeah, like, one guy had an opinion 40 years ago, but once something survives a single generation, it feels like it's been around forever, and it's enshrined as untouchable law. Because it's a norm. And all these solutions have the flaw of, like, not feeling like real government actions. Like, we don't think of the debt crisis as a thing that can be solved by just minting a coin, or waving a hand and declaring the government shutdown to no longer be possible because it's suddenly now unconstitutional, whereas before it wasn't. These things don't fall into our preconceived notion of how government is supposed to function. One may argue that they would decrease public faith in the system, as if it's possible for faith to decrease any further. And I just find this fascinating because it highlights how the U.S. government is just like a series of rules and a series of interpretations on those rules. Those interpretations can change, but, like, it's so vibe-based. Like, there are things that we think of our government having the ability to do and things we think of as not. And those societal norms are in many ways more important than the letter of the actual law.
Yeah. It's like, we call the coin solution infinite money glitch. But really, the real infinite money glitch is just print infinite money. And especially now that you can just change numbers on the computer, you don't even need more paper to do so. But it's just not something we imagine the populace as a whole imagines to be good. For the government to just say, oh yeah, we'll just print another $1 trillion, who cares? Even though that's how it works. But
it would also, like, assault the idea that the money is real, which the whole system doesn't function without people believing the money is real, or at least pretending that the money is real.
Yeah. Like, we've made allusions to other countries. I won't go too far down the rabbit hole because, you know, this is already, we've already talked a lot about economics, but, like, one of the things America does benefit from when it comes to being, you know, the number one superpower, the biggest economy in the world, well, / China nowadays, is that people have faith in American debt. That if you buy a treasury bond, the U.S. government will pay its interest and then eventually, pay you the value of that bond back. Is it? Okay.
I mean, I do it to you when you write the episode, so.
Finally, let's talk about whether or not there should be a debt ceiling at all. The debt ceiling was enacted out of a concern of federal debt growing out of control. It's also kept in place by sentiments that the existence of the national debt is, well, bad. But is it? The thing with debt is, like, if you've heard anything, you've probably heard that it's blown crazy out of control. in the past few decades, and it has increased a lot.
I remember being in 8th grade and watching CNN student news of Carl Azus and them being like, isn't it scary that, like, the debt is, I think maybe it was then, like, 17 trillion or whatnot, and, like, now it's 31 trillion, and, like, those are equally mind-boggling numbers. The human brain mathematically cannot process a billion, much less a trillion of anything. 17 and 31 trillion to the human brain are, on a practical level, equivalent, as just, like, a bunch. Beaucoup, as the French would say. And you could probably remember older times where people were, oh, it's bad that it's 12 million, or it's bad that it's 24 trillion. It's bad that it's 24 trillion. It's like there's no number that people won't say is bad.
Yeah, and like people will also cite it as percent of GDP. Currently, it's 120% of GDP. In comparison, in 1966, it was only 40%. But you can also, since we're bringing GDP into the table, surely if the debt's increased so much, our economy must be doing really badly because it's wrong to take on debt. Well, in 1966, our GDP was $815 billion. In 2023, it is $23 trillion. That is to say, our economy now is about 28 times larger than it was in 1966.
All riding on debt.
Yeah, clearly this has not slowed the pace of economic growth.
But Jay, what about the fact that we're leaving this debt for future generations to deal with? That's why we can't spend all this money fighting the climate change, because we have to think about the future. All right, no, sorry, I did try to be like a little fair in this section when I wrote it, but okay, so a common argument is that it's just morally wrong for the country to be in debt, that it like sets a bad example for its citizens, that it's unhealthy for a person to be in debt, so it's unhealthy for a country. And mainly this argument is just that the number looks bad, that it's a bad number, and when the bad number goes up means more bad. But like, folks mostly think it's bad because they are told it's bad. Again, this is very non-scientific, but whenever I talk to anyone between the ages of like 15 and 30 about the national debt, they're just like, well, I mean, I guess it's based on vibes. No one is taking economic and material data into account. They're just like, bad number, big means big bad. It's bad because it's bad. It's a weak fucking argument. But what will happen if America continues to grow in debt, they cry? Won't this keep folks from buying our debt in the future? Won't it restrict our future purchasing power?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, we mentioned earlier, back in 2011, our debt was downgraded from AAA to AA+, and not much changed. It did not have a major impact on the economy, to say the least. The fear is that at some point, playing fast and loose with America's debt will cause Americans and people around the world to value debt less highly. If American debt loses value, that could spell disaster for the country. In recent history, threats from bond traders were part of what stopped the disastrous monetary policy of Liz Truss during her short reign as British Prime Minister, which we went to in that episode. In his January article, The Big Problem with Any Debt Ceiling Fix, for Vox, Dylan Matthews wonders if this could happen to America and highlights how bond traders are cocky people who certainly think that they run the world.
I bring this up, even this seems kind of random, like, why are you typing this random article? I enjoy a lot of Dylan Matthews' reporting, some of his works on the debt ceiling and the fight around it, and his historical knowledge of it helped build the backbone of this document. What's fascinating about that article is how, like, short and bereft of content it is. It's just kind of like, this could be a problem. They certainly say it could be a problem. And luckily, all of these fears are almost certainly smoke and mirrors. There is no indication that American bonds will ever lose any significant value. So far, nothing has done it. Bonds can be a problem for Britain or Singapore or Chile or almost any other nation, but America is somewhat immune. And it's for the simple reason that its debt does not work like that of any other country. Strap in. So, when people talk World War II history and like the big meetings of the Allied powers, they'll often talk about, say, Yalta. Is it Yalta or Galta or... Wait.
Yeah, it is Yalta,
Galta's
yes.
a Magic the Gathering card.
No, it's Yalta.
My brain is fried. But one of the more important agreements was 1945's Bretton Woods, and this made the U.S. dollar the world reserve currency. Keynes was at that convention, by the way. Maynard Keynes, a big, important economic dude. And he was like, that's fucked up, but they ignored him. Now, this means that every currency would need to be convertible to dollars, or at least every currency that signed that agreement at the time. Following this, most banks around the world, from Japan to Nigeria, began to hold dollars in their vaults, kind of instead of maybe the British pounds they could have been holding before. And most governments hold these foreign currency reserves to like backstop their economy. I'm not going to pretend to fully understand the science and economics of it, but it makes them safer investments. Now, since World War II, the world has seen the United States lean away from manufacturing and import more and more goods. We in America tend to focus on all of those made from not America goods flowing in. But more importantly is the dollars flowing out. Jay, I don't know if this was your childhood, but I certainly heard plenty of conservative cranks, being like, we don't make anything in this country anymore.
Yeah.
Isn't it awful that we import more than we export? Like, I was taught about imports and exports in like 6th grade, and like the teacher was like, yeah, it's bad that we import more than we export. It's a deficit. Doesn't the word deficit sound bad? It's bad that we have a trade deficit. And that totally forgets the fact that you can flip it around and say that more dollars are flowing out of the country, and what those dollars are going to do once they flow out of the country. Jay, was that part of your childhood at all?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't so much as it was part of like the political debates that I paid attention to when I was younger, because I was a bit of a politics nerd from a relatively young age.
I, on the other hand, didn't know what a difference between a Democrat and Republican was until I was 17. Different strokes. Listen, I had bigger problems, okay?
Like I remember doing a persuasive speech on the issue of why the U.S. should leave Iraq in 7th grade. So that kind of goes into like a little insights into younger Jay.
I mean, 7th grade Azalea could have done that, but he also could have memorized all of the lightsaber fighting forms and how Star Wars history changed to allow for the evolution of each one of them.
Well, then it's because you're a Star Wars nerd.
Yes, but we can agree it's time equally well spent.
Maybe.
Now, foreign countries often have little to do with all of these dollars than to invest in U.S. bonds. If there's one thing you can buy with a U.S. dollar, it's a U.S. bond. In 1971, Richard Nixon uncoupled the U.S. dollar, and thus the world, from the gold standard. Before that, like, hypothetically, every $5, $10 note, whatever, was redeemable for some amount of gold that was all held in, Fort Knox. And we could go into like why he did this. It was to fund the Vietnam War because wars were expensive, but that's not really important. At that point in history, more governments kept their reserves in dollars than gold bars anyway. So, quoting from David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and this book is basically a history of money and exchange and exchange, commerce, trade, all of that. Quote, one effect of Nixon's floating of the central dollar was that foreign central banks have little they can do with these dollars, expect to use them to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This is what it is meant by the dollar becoming the world's reserve currency. Like, countries are literally holding them in reserve. He says in a separate section, insofar as the government issues treasury bonds, it actually, in a sense, is printing money, circulating debt tokens that have themselves come to replace gold as the world's reserve currency. I encourage you to read the book yourself. It's pretty heady stuff. Graeber goes on to talk about how all this is backed by America's capacity to violence and yada yada, and that's at the end of the book, and he does an entire history to see how we got to that point. But our current issue is far, far more basic than Graeber trying to get to the heart of what actually backs money.
Yeah.
Whether that be, war, gold, female bodies, or belief.
Yeah. So like the current currency composition for global foreign exchange reserves is 59% US dollar. So 59% of exchange reserves held around the world are held in US dollars. 21% are euro. 6% are yen. 5% are pound, and 10% is other.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, yuan is the Chinese currency. And if the Rick and Morty thing happens and the dollar certainly becomes worth zero, that means 59% of the world reserves are just wiped out. Obviously, there's no way that could happen, but that's the hypothetical scenario.
It's yen, not yuan. It's Japanese yen.
Oh, I'll just edit that out of the podcast.
Yuan is not a major reserve currency as of yet. The yuan was pegged to the dollar for a while, so for a while there would be no point. But yeah. Because of this, this means that the U.S. bond market cannot collapse without most of the world economy collapsing along with it. Such an act would throw many countries and institutions into chaos, to the point where it's scarcely believable that any of the powers would allow it to happen. This is also kind of why I also remember when I was younger, one of the scare tactics that people would use when talking about the debt was China can sell all its treasuries, can dump all its treasuries, and that'll collapse the U.S. economy. It's if they could collapse the U.S. economy and their own economy.
Yes, it is a bomb.
Yeah,
it is it is economic mutually assured destruction.
Yeah,
one could argue that we went from nuclear to economic mad over the course of the 20th century.
Yeah. You can probably remember a few months ago when a minor bank in California failed, and President Biden was on TV 2 days later to assure the country that everyone would get their money back. When institutional funds are actually under threat, governments act very swiftly and very efficiently.
And we know we're playing a little fast and loose, but anyone can, no one can predict the future. In 2008, the big banks got bailed out. Obviously I don't know for sure that if there was a monetary crisis that the government would step in, would not step in to fix it, and that the governments of the world would not support that decision. But when you look at what happened, say, in 2020, when the stock market crashed because of COVID shutdowns and the economy briefly tanked and then was artificially revivified by a mass infusion of funds, it's very clear, at least to me, and this is going to depend on your own politics, what you think, And if you have different politics from me, I thank you for sticking through what you may find to be inane arguments. But there is a thumb and there is a scale. When you think the thumb is going to be applied to the scale is your own prerogative, but it certainly can be. Again, there's plenty of pain, like the inflation pain is going through right now, that is considered to be acceptable by the system, and we could consider it unacceptable if we chose. But when it comes to every country in the world having their economy melt down, I just don't see that happening without the people who can press the no button pressing that button. Anyway, in conclusion, the debt ceiling is fought over because politicians on both sides of the aisle are comfortably gambling with the lives of everyday Americans. Non-everyday Americans, by which I mean the rich who fund those politicians, do not have the same concerns. The next time you hear someone wallowing in pity about how much of a shame public debt is, remember, the number only rose that high because it benefited everyone in power. And that number is part of what's keeping their world in place. The money is not real, but your belief in it is, and most of us will continue to believe in the systems that keep us down. Partially because we don't know how to do anything else, because no one is competent. Holy shit, we survived! Jay, we made it.
That wasn't bad.
I don't know. Yeah, I do like catastrophizing in my head. I gotta do what my psychiatrist told me and lean on my antipsychotics more. I tried to do that today.
I would definitely not consider this the worst episode. I think it was perfectly fine.
I just find I don't know. It kind of like ends and then it starts again, and like there's a lot of opinion. There's a lot of like shoddy research because I am obscenely bad at research. Anyway, we hope y'all enjoyed that episode. Follow us, support the podcast, get out there, live your best life. Don't kill yourself. Don't rape anybody. Other than that, fucking get out there and don't let your dreams be memes. This is the No One Is Competent podcast, signing off.